HLTV Awards, top 20, all those fans, come here. It's time for another episode. We have Harry, who's been getting some very kind messages after the top 20 show, after the top 20 countdown. And our guest this week is going to be KingT. Has his own takes on a couple of these spots, potentially at odds with Harry. Get him some more DMs. Anything in particular that you know that you're going to be picking a fight about?
Ooh, well, that's the thing. You say specifically that Harry might have a fight about. I'm not sure where Harry stands on a lot of things. But I know there's a certain AWPer who is about 20 spots too high. And I have some issues with certain awards as well that, you know, some of the picks have irked me. So I'll be curious to get some insight into how the process works as well from you guys, and maybe potentially leak me who the panel members are so I can, you know, send them some comments as well. Because I feel like if the fans are the ones sending abuse my way, I should be able to send abuse to other people too.
You see, the panel, we love our panel so much that we post all their names, but we don't post who they vote for. And this is something that every year we review it a little bit. We're like, the team's they're being a bit cheeky here. But genuinely, 95% of people don't take the piss. But there's always that 5%. And we're not going to be able to confirm, but because part of the show today, we're going to show you how the votes actually lined up, like how many people were first, how many people were second. So here you go, straight away. And you can see there's a red herring here, and I'm not going to point it out, but there's something different here. But anyway, so yeah, we're not making votes public. That's not something we're going to do. We might do it next year. Who knows? But anyway, this is number one.
But it's anyone's guess who a Turkish in-game leader potentially voted for out of these players.
Oh. And you've not seen it, so you're just guessing too, of course.
No, complete guess, of course. Of course.
Literally no idea. No idea who didn't rate Donk's year. No idea. But yeah, so we have... Because I wanted to show this because a lot of people use the EliGE third thing as like, how can the third best opener of the year, like, come on, this is literally. So EliGE, Antares, Flames, EMA, and Xerxin, all pretty much the same. It was basically decided by if anyone wanted to be a bit outrageous and put them above Nico or Donk. Like, that's where the point difference is, because you get 5 points for first, 3 points for second, 1 point for third. So that's kind of how this happens. And then obviously rational human beings do Donk and Nico, and then it's their choice for third, right? Some people didn't do that, and EliGE managed to creep in, but it's all very similar. Actually, Xerxin got the most votes as third, but because they were all for third place, that he just didn't quite get in.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you think? How would you have gone with this?
I didn't particularly think anything of this. I saw the top three nominated. I was like, all right, cool, yeah. Donk, Nico, EliGE, whatever. It's then Quacker, who you guys might be familiar with, not everyone else is entirely, who then starts DMing me talking about EliGE, third. I thought, like, you know, he barely played any big event playoffs. What the hell's going on here? Is, you know, he starts ranting on, you know, he likes to talk. If you've met him, he's a ranter. I let him go off. Okay. But I thought about it. I looked at it. I was like, you know, to be fair, if EliGE has enough maps, has enough playoff runs, have all that crap to be really considered amongst the openers of the entire year, I was kind of irked by the Xantares not being up there as well. I was like, Xantares for me would be a better opener, more effective, more productive. Sure, he doesn't have a big number of big event maps, but I was like, neither does EliGE, right? And Xantares has, for me, quite impressive runs, quite deep. So I was like, that's the guy to have third. But at that point, I'm splitting hairs, really. I'm talking about two players who don't have a massive amount of big event runs to go off of. We're talking about 0.02 opening KPR, potentially differential between them. That's the only place I could see some negotiation. So I'm kind of happy that I look at this list. It's like, yeah, everyone from EliGE onwards is basically at the same level from the panel. And the two clear players at the top are at the top. And it's just a bit of a feeding frenzy for those final few points.
I mean, I think this was probably the most straightforward category out of them all, minus the third position. Personally, I put Flames in because I weighed it similarly to how we do top 20, which is EliGE just didn't have the playoff maps and their arena maps comparatively. So I think I had Flames as my number 3, but I think it's pretty hard to argue with like the top 2 of this list. And then once you get down to third, it is a little bit more picky, but in the end, does that really matter that much? Because you're really fighting over the scraps a little bit.
Yeah, now, it's just you know, it's just a fun opening to the show. Okay, leave me alone. I think because the issue with a lot of these panel votes is like first and second. I'd say for most of the categories were like kind of boring this year. Like there was kind of obvious places to go. So I don't know, because a lot of people ask like how close was third, how close was fourth. So we'll just show it off. We'll just show it off. You don't need to.
You've got to feel bad for Malbs, don't you? Though, like realistically, he was one of the best T-side openers for the year. But the fact that he's on G2 and the fact that on CT side he only gets to really do his thing like 1 or 2 maps means he just gets relegated way down. But he was bonkers on T side for G2. It's just it was half the year. Nico's still there, still doing enough, I think, to just keep himself just ahead as like the primary opener for the team. But Malbs had a crazy year, so hopefully he can get himself. He should be in this list. If this year goes right, he should be number 2 at worst in this coming year, I think.
I mean,
100%.
This one was straightforward. I mean, like you said, Harry, closer also kind of straightforward. Anchor, kind of straightforward. I mean, if we look at both, we have 2 Navi players. Could it really have been anybody else?
Yes, it's not just the top 20 that loves the team achievement. Put it that way. I think our lovely panel do the same thing. Because I think the Anchor one, like, I know why people love Bit so much. I think a lot of it is a very much an eye test thing. But I think if you look at his actual year, like I think he was much more inconsistent than people think he was. And it depends how you see the award, right? Because we don't tell the panel what you're voting off. So I think if I was looking at it, I'd be like, would I rather have Jimmy or Bit anchoring a bomb site for me? Like, I think that's a toss-up. I think that's closer than this vote is. But I think obviously, like, if you include T-sides as well, I think then Bit has the better year. Of course he does. But I do think, I thought Jimmy was going to be a bit closer on this one. I really do.
I think he should be. He's my pick for Anchor of the Year, but it was one of those, this is one of the ones that I'm like, I have a dispute with this. I disagree, but I'm not mad. Right? I'm not mad at the panel. I'm like, Bit, CT side anchoring, has some iconic spots, some iconic highlights, some really great peaks. You're right, he has had a more inconsistent year than people really realize, and that can be said for the entirety of Navi, but we'll get into that probably at some point. Because I was irked by some people calling certain awards write-offs, easy. It's like we forgot spring happened, but whatever. Jimpphat, yeah. Clear number 2. I don't think it should have been that big a gap, but yeah, not mad about this one. This one's fine.
And I was glad Zontics got third, just because Flames is like I wanted Flames to get third in opener, but in this, like I wanted Zontics who actually, you know, like Flames spends too much time in connector for my liking. Like honestly, like I know he's an A anchor, but like come on, if Apex is your con player, like you're the star player, even if you're like the anchor, like it doesn't really count. So I was happy with the panel on this one as well. I'm glad he got that nomination.
And we move on to closer. Do you think this is also just as straightforward?
Is this a rifler only award? I'm sorry. Like,
so closer. So we had a whole thing about naming the awards, and I'm also iffy on some of the names because I think a lot of people hear closer and they like want to put Shiro in or like want to put Orpus in, right? Closer is basically, for complicated reasons, a long time ago, we didn't want to say entry fragger of the year, support of the year, lurker of the year, because we wanted it to be more easily defined. And there was a thing about aggressive lurkers. Like in my head, this is basically lurker of the year because that's how like it's defined. It's players who play in extremity positions on T side, right? Like all these players. Like Nertz is a very aggressive player, but he played from lurk position, so he's in this category, not an opener. And that's just the way it's decided. But yeah, closer of the year is, think of it as lurker of the year, and you're not going to go too far wrong. But it's called closer, so there you go.
Yeah, you can't throw closer in front of me and not expect me to get frustrated when I don't see Shiro, don't see Monacy. A close rounds. That's what they did year long. Like that's what I expected to see up here. When I see 2 Navi players and you're telling me it's now lurker of the year, oh okay, sure, yeah, that's their entire style. Fuck it, why not? It all makes sense now, but yeah, just by itself, on the surface with that name, Monacy not being on there was aggressively like irritating. Like I'm keeping myself polite, but I was furious.
It's a comms problem.
It really is. Yeah.
So Harry, what you're saying is now that the definitions don't meet what you originally intended, you're just going to redefine it and change the narrative like that.
Well, I always wanted it to be called Lurker of the Year, and I've got no further comment. But on that one.
Not your fault, just like the other top 20, like EliGE placing where he did. None of it's your fault, naturally.
Some of it's obviously my fault, because sometimes, like on most of them, we all agreed. But it's... so I think that's... Obviously, we'll get to the top 20, because I think the interesting part of the top 20 is people's criteria for it. And a lot of the people in my DMs don't have criteria for it. Put it that way, because when you want to talk about it, you want to engage with not individual decisions, but the reasons why we made those decisions, right? And I think a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people are like, I watched him 2 months ago and he was amazing, so put him higher, which is a different thing. But yeah, one for later.
Okay, let's get through the role ones quickly then, because we have obviously m0NESY taking AWPer of the year. This was, in my brain at least, a no-brainer because ZywOo does hybrid a lot. He rifles more than m0NESY does by far, and m0NESY was clear and away the top AWPer of the year.
Okay, what if it was just the last 6 months of the year when ZywOo started AWPing more?
I mean, it's more of a conversation, but I still had m0NESY edging it there.
I mean, yeah, same, obviously, because I'm a G2 super fan, remember? So it's not a conversation for me. I just wondered. Because I know Maui's one of those people who always talks about, like, since ZywOo picked up the AWP, he's been blah, blah, blah. Like, Cologne especially was really, really good. But yeah, I think we all know where I stand on the m0NESY ZywOo 2024 one.
Yeah, I see some real interesting picks in this one. Some of those little, as you mentioned, those little biased take the piss picks just cropping up here. As Shiro gets a first place, Woxic gets a first place.
Yeah.
I don't know who could have given Woxic the first place. It's really anyone's guess.
It really is. It really is. And then, but I want to give credit to Complexity because they did the classic thing. Is the voting public? ? Because and then Graham just said to me like straight up, we're going to put us first and everything. But then you said it wasn't. But then I'm going to temper it. And he did manage to put a handle on his players. So thank you to Messioso. Because otherwise we would have had Hauslock first, JT first, TC first. So he saved our bacon a little bit there.
I mean, even IGL Coach of the Year, again, Navi doesn't seem like... is this Team of the Year or is it Role of the Year, Harry?
Well, this is the IGL and Coach. It's up to the experts. No, it's up. How do the experts analyze these things? They have supreme eye tests that are superior to everyone at HLTV. And at the end of the day, they just go on Wikipedia and sort by trophies. So
yeah,
that's not really our fault either.
That's how it works, though, right?
They're hard to argue with this one.
It is kind of hard to argue with this one.
Yeah,
it works. It works. Trophies work.
There was a point where I thought the Hallie Spirit vlog propaganda might let him somehow eclipse Blade, but I'm glad to see that it was this decisive. Not to say that Hallie doesn't have impact. I think he's a great coach, but I think the amount of emphasis they put in those vlogs on him, I think is deserved, but not over Blade after this kind of year that Navi had.
Yeah, I mean, it's the more controversial ones are the ones I feel really bad for, which is actually like who would have been 9th and 8th, basically, which is like the Ash ones. Like not having Ash on this did physically hurt me. Yeah. Like we were looking at it for a long time. And we was thinking of like all these like T-side metrics and like your map pool and like winning above expect. It's just like we were looking at so many different things. And at the end of the day, you just have to either go all out and be like, this is HLTV's subjective top 10 coaches of the year, right? Using things that you would trust an expert to do, right? But it's not really the spirit of the awards. And obviously my top 10 would have Ash on it. But when we're looking at it, we just present the panel, the coaches of the 10 best teams of the year, and then they select the winner from that, right? And I think that's a good way to get a good top 3. Is it a good way to get the best top 10? Obviously not. But you're not going to get a complete throw out from this method. And I obviously would love to have my subjective top 10 because that's how everyone's subjectivity works. You want your best 10. But for the last 3 years, this is how we've done it. And I think this may be the first year we've published the top 10. I think there probably were similar cases previously where if you weren't in the top 10 team, like you get snubbed. And it is a snub. It is a snub. I think Ash is obviously a top 10 coach of the year, but I don't think he would have gotten the top 3, to be honest. So
I don't think there's any other teams picking like Gamer Legion's coach to be coach of the year when they have played them once an RMR, maybe at most. You know, that was never going to happen. But Mara, like when I think about what takes, you know, what should go into considering who's a great coach, had a great year as a coach, I feel kind of bad for him missing out number 3. I'm going to be honest. Like for me, the story of the year was him and these ragtag pizzas with Blitz. Young kids, not playing Tier 1 CS originally, just literally people he's plucked out of LAN cafes for some of them, and developed into one of the best Counter-Strike teams in terms of how they play as a unit, how they're able to actually execute. Going from very simple ideas early on to more complicated play as time progressed, that was one of the most obvious and amazing coaching jobs we've ever witnessed. I'm happy he's fourth, because when I saw 1, 2, 3, I was like, yeah, obviously, easy snub, but man, he should have been higher. He should be higher. I could honestly sit and debate a case against Halley for him to be even top 2, but number 3 felt like a minimum for me. But
not
I
enough
get what you
those
mean.
Vlogs, though.
Yeah, right. They do better propaganda.
Stop rejecting our interviews, and then he's straight in.
Just gifs of Genghis Khan isn't enough. Like, we need something more from the Mongol social media side.
Yeah, and I think Saw as well. I mean, it's a little bit recency biased because they didn't have a great year overall. But it's always like, if I'm thinking, if I was a super team and I was recruiting a coach first, I think Saw would be like top of the list, pretty much. So, but he came 5th. It's still good for a year where he didn't really do much until the last 2 months.
We did kind of skip over it, but
is the road one. I think Chopper is pure trophy brain. I don't think he was a top 3 IGL of the year. I think Donk was the best player of the year and Halley was a top 2 coach of the year, is what I think about this one. But, you know, it's... the question is,
what was your personal top 3, Harry?
So I think Alexi and I think Carrigan, because of the start of the year, I think deserves a little bit of credit too. And then third, honestly, it's kind of difficult. It's actually very difficult. I don't think a lot of them... I think AWPex would say himself he didn't have a great year. I think Shuey wasn't able to get Mouse over the hump. I think you could maybe make an argument for Blitz, but again, not enough interviews. Major probably suffered a bit from not making second major. Snacks is Snacks. And then Kixan, like that was again, just too little too late. And then James here because he was on a top 10 team, not because anyone thinks he's a top 10 IGL. So I think maybe Chopper still gets third just because you do have to go trophy brain a little bit and say that, oh, like he's making the system, blah, blah, blah. And Apex and Chewy didn't have quite good enough years. But I think I would have just thrown one out for Blitz third. I think for how young that team is, I think like as much as we want to credit Mara as well, I think you have to give the in-game leader a lot of credit for how good they look in some of these mid-rounds as well. And I think, but that's pure subjective because it's just because of interviews and vlogs, I'm like, Spirit System is more down to Halley than Chopper. I don't know that. I can't speak Russian when I'm standing next to them. I don't know what they're saying, but that's just, and this is the thing with these IGL and Coach Awards that we're never going to be able to fix, and we just have to trust the panel that scrim against them, that play against them, that should know the systems inside out. And I think a lot of the time you are going to get the best IGL and the best coach from the same team because like there's only so much people can actually do from the outside.
Yeah. As long as it's just Eternal Fire mucking about every year, we'll be all right. It won't be too egregious.
So this leads us into the All-Star Off, as Harry aptly named it. What an excellent name, first of all. But secondly, walk us through this list, Harry.
Yes, this was rapidly thrown together because we were going to do a social media post and then we didn't. So there's no graphic. But it's I just wanted to see quickly, which of these 3 teams do you think is best? And it's like it's in their year, right? So 2023 ZywOo versus 2024 Manassi, for example. So which of these teams, because this is we've done it 3 years in a row now. It says Nico's the anchor. Nico's obviously the opener.
Yeah, I switched those around eventually. I stared at it for a second and thought...
I was just like, I've just noticed that. Yeah. Very rapidly thrown together. Not like me to make mistakes, obviously. So yeah, what team would you take out of this one from each year?
I think 2022.
Yeah.
Having a heavy, simple, and Carrigan bias in my mind, but still, you know, I've got Nico and simple. I don't need to elaborate. I think I win most games. I also have the right IGL for that. And if I had to go purely off star power for the year, Axel 2022 is kind of good. Like that's the weak link, I think, and that's still pretty strong.
I'd have to agree with that. I also think the 2024 year, even after the All-Star lineup came out, who was it, Harry, at the award show? You showed me a tweet. I think it might have even been from Modesty that said, "Who's what, the actual closer of this team or something?"
It was like, who's the bitch, basically. And I think that's the thing that stands out is like Perfecto and Majors, they're like your classic overqualified support players, but they're still support players, right? Like they're anchor of the year because they've been given tough spots because they weren't star players like that. Whereas Bit, I think this is very much a CS2 thing, is like a lot of these lurkers who are star players are taking anchor spots. And it's when I defined the award 2 years ago, it worked much better at getting these kind of fourth best player in your team, sometimes third maybe, of who pretty much, they don't get to choose their spots. I think Bit is a specialist anchor who does actually like a lot of his positions. So it's a different type of thing. I still think the team would work in practice because, I mean, it's got Donk and Monacy on it, so I think you'd be fine. But yeah, I don't think it's as balanced as previous years, and I think it's something to look at for sure. I mean, I take 2023 if it wasn't for the in-game leader spot. I think Carrier in 2022 is obviously like probably the best year of these three overall. But I think Majors anchoring Nico and Rops were just unbelievable that year as well. Like that's got all top three players in it. I think it was ZywOo, Nico, Rops, right? So it's got the three best players of the year. I'm taking that team every time.
Kind of shows you the IGL difference though a little bit. The 22 is even weighed more just solely because of Kerrigan a little bit.
Yeah. But there's also it's also simple. It's also simple. Well, after we've gone through the actual separate awards that were given at the show, we did do this little thing called the top 20. Now, we do it every year. There's never ever such a thing as controversies. I'm not really sure what you included this slide for, Harry, because it's unquestionably the truth as to who we rank as the top 20 players in the world, and just can't have any disagreements at all. You need to be careful saying that, because I said that on the show and I thought it was an obvious joke. Apparently people thought I was being serious. It is insane. But yeah, obviously you're allowed to disagree with the criteria, not with the list. Different thing.
So yeah, you put the slide next. Why Senzu? Why did you do this to Senzu?
Well, I think so. He was in a lot of people's predicted top 20s. So I thought it was worth talking about him briefly because, I mean, basically he just didn't really do anything at the actual big events this year. There was like the Pro League run where he has a 1.19 rating. I Am Cologne 1.2 rating, right? And that looks really good on paper because it's a decent amount of maps, but this is all lower bracket stuff. He's not close to an EVP. And then the major, everyone remembers the opening stage and everyone remembers the group stage. And he had a 0.5 rating in that playoff series. Like if he'd have got that EVP at the Shanghai Major, where like realistically, all he needed to do was like not fuck up, just go like barely positive and you probably get an EVP. But he threw so badly that it's just kind of tanked his rating for that event. And also the thing with the top 20 is the stats, we don't look at non-MVP events, right? So Senzu had some massive peaks at lands that basically didn't count for the top 20. And it's unfortunate, but there's a reason why we don't take these events is because they do inflate people's ratings. So Senzu, 1.40 at ESL Challenger Jimpphat, 1.37 at Extremes Land, 1.34 at Misa Pro Finals, and then 1.27 at Misa Nomadic Masters. He had a 1.21 at the Thunder Pick they won over Heroic. Like, so these are even a 1.2 at Espo. So all the events that we didn't count, he was basically like farming. And that's just one of the things that's unfortunate for him. And I think that's probably why he was lower than people expected, is just because we're looking at a more narrow sample of events for these lists. And at those events, he got an EVP at Yala Compass. And then other than that, he didn't really get too close, really. So that's why he's so low. But I don't know if maybe KingT, what do you think?
This one didn't surprise me. I didn't think he would make the top 20. And personally, if I do an end of year list, I don't always. And if I do, it's just for a show. And I don't even do beyond 15 because I'm like, at some point with my personal categories, I'm going to be splitting so many hairs that I don't bother. And Senzu didn't make my top 15. So I was just pure and simple. Like the events that matter, he didn't do it. Like he wasn't that guy. He was amazing at a bunch of events that, were smaller. And he played well against big teams, which means that going into this year, you can project him to be, a star player on a team that should be competitive, should be making playoffs. Maybe this year will be a lot better for him. But no, I didn't really expect him to make top 20 just based off the things you've described. Like I knew those things going into it. It's not an MVP event. HLTV don't care. And that's fine. Honestly, that's not really something I'm bothered by as far as the categories you filter by. So yeah, it's a shame. And he will have people will remember those big events that he had that aren't big events.
Yes.
They'll be sort of pigeonholed away as like highlight moments. Senzu, this is the player that bloomed into what we have now. Back then, though, they didn't count for much.
There is a really
felt
easy
bad for
way.
the rookie part, right? Just because he was below Zontics. But yeah, sorry, carry on.
There is a really easy way to make your own personal top 20 list of the year, which is just go to stats for 2024 and sort by rating. It's really no trouble. Super easy to do.
People would prefer it as well, I think, because it's just objective. Because the numbers can't lie, and they never need additional context either. So that's the way to do it.
Personally, I was surprised to see how many people thought Senzu would make the top 20 just because of exactly how we factor in the ratings. But, after doing this for 4 years, I'm not as surprised just because it seems like people never actually take a look at how stuff is weighted with arena events. Also, apparently Harry made up arena event rating. Congratulations, Harry. You've created a new stat that we measure. Definitely has been there for before you were hired.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally been there since 2010, I think. Peter's always had playoff rating. It's just always been there. And Senzu, he played 2 arena maps and got a 0.5 rating. And because he played 2 maps, it doesn't really count against him. It's just more that it's just not there. Like there's just no sample. And that's one of the things. But yeah, just quickly wanted to address that because did have some people asking about Senzu being below like Device and Zontics, but those guys had good events at big events. And so Senzu unfortunately just didn't this year. I think next year he should be able to, but yeah, just not where we were looking, unfortunately.
We also had Nerds miss out on the list.
This hurt me. I'll let you go first on this one. Maybe I'll defend it afterwards.
Man, I know when I look at this sort of thing, I'm very much about how you played and not how much you played, which works to some AWPer's advantage. But this guy, prototypical, like stuck on a terrible team, which is completely in chaos, doing what he can. And by the end of the year, actually racked up a couple nice events. And I'm like, this could be it. I'm not talking he has to be 11th on the HLTV list. Like 20th would have been cool. I was so looking forward to seeing him just edge in just because he did manage to just about carry his team to a real playoff appearance at a couple of events. I thought that was enough. I thought that was surely enough combined with the actual level of play we saw. The combination would have done it. But yeah, eye test, not really a thing on HLTV. So it was, I guess, too low volume, too late. You keep saying if heroic players and coaches and IGL's like too little, too late. And it's a bit of a womp thing for them. But realistically for me, Nohte, if I think about 2024, who are the 20 best players of the year, I will not have any qualms with saying Nohte, no matter how weak the sample, no matter how underperformant the roster was overall. Nohte for me was easily one of the 20 best players of the year. I just don't have HLTV standard of evidence, You're kind of like the scientific paper like that I have to try and publish. Like you're just holding me to a level that I just can't prove, but I know it's true.
I mean, the next one, it's when we were doing it, because obviously it's quite hard for me because you kind of have to leave your eye test at the door a little bit because it's just not really what it is. Like you kind of have to, because we try so hard to avoid recency bias as well. And I think Nohte is a little bit of the recency bias because he was really good at Rio. He's really good at the major until kind of like the last map, basically. So I think it is a little bit of that, and you just kind of have to leave that at the door completely. But I agree. I think the 20 best players in the world right now, I think Nohte is obviously on that list. And I think he was, even when Heroic were a bad team, not getting to playoffs as well. One thing that did count against him a little bit is the first major, which everyone has obviously forgot because it was 9 months ago, but Nohte had a really stinky first major. which is 0.84 rating, 0.55 KPR, doesn't help you at the end of the year when, we are looking, because he was 21st, right? And that's the worst place to be because it's not on your HLTV profile, and you might as well have been 50th. You might as well have had a terrible year. So that still had a good year. We weren't saying he didn't have a good year, but we're comparing him to Torsey. So Torsey was 20th, and Torsey had, you're splitting hairs a little bit with that one, but Torsey had just a few things. So Torsey played 42 big event playoff maps this year, and he had a 1.07 rating. Like, he was the one in Mouse who didn't bottle it, basically. Nuts only played 8 all year, and he was negative. He was 0.96. And I hate using sample size as the tiebreaker a lot of the time, but when someone has the sample size over someone and they're better in it, then it becomes quite difficult to kind of put someone lower above. And I think we'll get to it with EliGE and Xantares a bit later on, because they're the kind of sample size Andes who did make it into the list. But for Nertz, it just wasn't quite enough. And I think, the one with Torsey, it was close. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't close, but Torsey just had kind of, if you look at their top 7 events ish, Torsey's maybe 4th to 7th was just way better, basically. Their top 3 pretty similar, but then as you go deeper, I think Torsey just had the edge. But yeah, Nuts is the type of player. He's my type of player, basically. But I have to leave that at the door, unfortunately.
Yeah, the Torsey comparison's interesting, because you just think, if Nuts' teams had just made playoffs, then collapsed, and he didn't collapse, that's the same narrative. At that point, no, they collapsed far before the playoffs most of the year. And then I'm not sure what you've got coming up, but there's a conversation about the Torsey-Zershan dynamic of getting you to playoffs, then completely embarrassing yourself versus just not embarrassing yourself the entire time. Which one should be more valued? Because I was surprised to see, there's a couple players here, I think, that are from the same team that are very far apart and in the wrong order in my eyes. So I'm curious to see what the rationale is there in terms of Zershan, because he was abhorrent in the majority of playoff games, especially the ones, that end up eliminating them. He's just terribly underperforming. It's not even close to his level. And if he was able to maintain that level for back-to-back series, basically they'd have several event wins. Even his average, not above his average, just his average. But he's so often so far below it that it just frustrated me. And that's why I struggled when I saw that one, because I was like, Torsey not going first has to deal with basically 3 dead bodies already in front of him. Everything's a 2v5 when you're Mouse in the playoffs and you're the AWPer. It's really difficult.
Harry didn't even put Exertion on the Controversies list, actually, so he fully stands by that placing.
Well, I actually think most people would have said we had him too low, to be honest. But we could skip to Jimmy, because I think it's a similar conversation. We could just talk about Miles with Jimmy on screen. So the one with Torsey is basically he just didn't really peak. It's all well and good that you were okay in playoffs, but he didn't really put together an actual event to event peaks where you actually are in the MVP race or you're getting EVPs from it. It's more that over the year he's good in the big matches, but he's not nothing crazy. He's more just a 1.07 AWPer in big matches. And like I said, and that's, it's above the average AWPer. The average AWPer is 103 for the year, including the in-game leading AWPers and every bad AWPer. So it's still fine, but it's is that going to move you up the top 20? Not really. It's more just, it gets you into the top 20. Whereas Jimmy and Zershan, a lot of it is in group stage and quarterfinals or whatever, but they had much more that got them further. And someone like Jimmy had a really good Esports World Cup playoffs, for example. That was really, really strong. I think it was 1.3 rating even or something. So that helped him a lot. But again, was he too low? I think for some people, maybe yes. And this is where we get into me inventing arena rating to punish players because... okay, I'll just get out quickly. So Jimmy, he had a 103 arena rating, which is pretty bad. You're just an average player at that point. But in big matches, it was 109, which is better than Torsey. And that's mainly because of World Cup, because that was the only playoffs he was really good at.
Yeah.
So it does inflate it a little bit. But Jimmy was getting better at big matches. He wasn't a Zershan level fraud in big matches, but yet he's below Zershan because Jimmy's best events were all at small events. So it's like Chengdu was the lowest big event, and then he had Dacha 1, Dacha 2. World Cup was legit. He was great in playoffs. Rio was legit. He was great there too. But Zershin's peaks were what won Mao's tournaments, even if they were in studios. He actually was in the MVP race multiple times and basically did get the Pro League MVP. Like, it was him and ZywOo so close. But just ZywOo had it because he had stupid numbers for the whole tournament. But Zershin had a better final, and you could give it to Zershin easily. So this is how we kind of ended up with Mao's in this order, was that I think Torsey deserved to scrape into the top 20, because we are looking at, like when you look back at the year, Mao's were a very, very good team in a lot of playoffs, and you kind of have to say, well, who deserves credit for getting them that far? And I think Zershin had the best peaks, Jimmy probably had the best floor, and then Torsey didn't let them down in the arena moments when others did. So that's kind of how we ended up in that order. But yeah, it's always hard ranking teammates. I think that's when you really test the criteria the most, because there's no sample size get out clause, right? And this is, I guess, how we landed.
What would your personal order have been, KingT?
I would have probably had like the mouse players in a small trio clustered towards the back of it. Like, I wanted Jimpphat to be better. And especially when you come to the end of the year, and I have to justify, like, I see it right now, like 0.15 above target CT rating. Like, I have to do a lot of that sort of justification for Jimpphat in terms of his overall stats not being that insane. But I'm like, yeah, but remember, he is the anchor. He is a support player for half the game. And the other half, he's barely active as a lurker, not given a lot of opportunity. I had to do a lot of that. So for me, I wouldn't have minded any order as long as it was just a nice little group of them towards the back of the pack. As you said, good enough to get you on the list, but also the fact that you don't go and win a bunch of big events, you do utterly collapse mentally, at least a couple of you certainly do, over and over again, just has to hold you back. So for me, yeah, Zershin has those big runs, and you're right, when he's on, he wins them events. The fact that he's so often off when they need him and there's a crowd looking at him, for me that's a huge part of the year. The year is defined by majors, prestige events. It's not defined by pro leagues. As much as ESL initially wanted that to be their flagship, they fucked that up. It's not, and no one cares, especially me. Zershin being great there doesn't move me. I need him to do something when 10,000 eyes are upon him, and he has disappointed time and time again. And that, for me, has to, like, in my eyes, pull him back. But I get why, for you, just keeping the criteria consistent, I think it makes sense that he ends up a bit further, but I need him further back. That's just, I think, personally, the sort of clash I have with the HLTV ranking in that sense. It's a very personal clash. I can't justify it with consistent logic across all your little things. Like, for me, it's a violent opposition to that failing.
I think Zershin's interesting because it is an eye test thing too. It's not just that he has a terrible rating. He literally changes the way he plays, because he's so based on these timing plays and everything. But yeah, and to be fair, I think arena rating did hold him back quite a lot, but it was, that's in a later stage of the list, right? I think he did enough to put him higher under our criteria. And I also, no, I've done it again. I fucking rigged this whole podcast. I've got the one person who thinks arena rating should have been more important on the list as the guest. Literally, only person in the world who thinks we actually I should invent like arena top 4 rating versus top 3 teams and just see who comes out, because I don't think we're going narrow enough. Genuinely, I think this list suffers from with being too broad with this arena rating, because what if you played Saw in a quarterfinal like FaZe did and then lost? Like, come on, we've got to be more harsh. But yeah,
let's talk about somebody who barely played in arenas and thus ended up being placed 19th. Surprisingly, I think a lot of people, maybe somewhat justifiably thought that EliGE would be higher, but at the same time, it goes back to that same conversation we were having earlier about using the criteria we actually weigh and using that to see how the list would sort out. And in this case, it's just not actually having arena maps is really going to bite you, especially when Harry's doing the ranking.
It's the big matches too. It's one. So Complexity made one playoffs all year, right? It's just Pro League. It's just Pro League. And I know some people are like, oh, he played on stage in Shanghai. Well, it's like, it's a fucking group stage. Like, everyone relax. Like, just because there's some fans. That's not really... Like, when we say arena rating, we're talking about the most prestigious events with big stadiums full. which, and I guess the major is that, but it's still a group stage and the level of competition is just completely different to like a Cologne playoffs or even like an IEM playoffs. It's a different thing completely. And yeah, you look at EliGE and we put the notable stats in and it's just like, yeah, this is we're going to get some heat for this because he's top 6 in like everything. And you can see that it's not his fault complexity are bad because he's got the 5th best rating in elite elimination matches of everyone. And yes, a lot of that's lower brackets because complexity are bad and they're playing bad teams. But still, if you've got that high rating, like you're not holding back your team that much. And it's basically cases like EliGE and K-Serato last year, although it's weird with like a passive saver versus EliGE monster opener. It is a bit different, but it's similar in that how high can you go when a key part of the list is adding value to your team in terms of taking them quite far into tournaments. And that includes seeing how good you are under pressure. And EliGE, the highest pressure he had was like a lower bracket decider match for most of the year. And sure, he was amazing in them, but when you're comparing him to, so the person right above him was Rops, okay? And you can say very fairly, EliGE for most of 2024 was a much better player. But you're looking at EliGE's major run, and EliGE has nothing close to comparable to what Rops did in Shanghai. Like absolutely nothing. In fact, the majors he was pretty bad. And in Copenhagen complexity were 2-0, and then he was bad. And then they didn't make Shanghai top 16 as well. So it's one of those. It's a different list to a list of my eye test saying which rifler would I want trading me into a bomb site. EliGE's top 3, probably. It's like Donk, Nico, EliGE, sure. But for the list, it's just, and a lot of the events where, because it is possible to get like a group stage EVP. If you play really well against the really good teams, we can give you an EVP for that. But EliGE often, even when he ended with good ratings, didn't really put together a whole event to get close to the EVPs. Like it was just that Pro League run where they were very good and then I think it was semis, I think, beat MIBR in quarters, I think. So it was still a bit dodgy because like a lot of those maps aren't against top teams, even if they are big matches. So yeah, it's a test of criteria.
JT, do you think this is justified or is Harry waffling?
No, he's entirely right, honestly. And the one criticism I think someone could levy at you that would be kind of reasonable is Nohte's made more playoffs. Like at real events, he had a better major run. Mm-hmm. You know, there's an argument to be made that Nohte should swap with him entirely. But yeah, you're right in saying EliGE is, if you're just using your eye test, he's definitely one of the 20 best players. And he's definitely far higher than 19th. But we can't really, for this kind of thing where you're trying to be objective, you can't judge him on what he didn't do. And what he didn't do is actually make playoffs over and over again because he was playing with complexity. Like, let's be honest, he was playing with Grim and Floppy rather than Frozen and Rain. You know, that's a big difference between him and Robs. He can't control that. He's now realized he can and has moved to FaZe, and now he's playing with better players. And so he'll probably get far more playoff runs in eventually. Not yet, but
still miss Blast Bounty though.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, not yet. They'll get it right eventually. With enough attempts, he'll get more than the one Pro League EVP, I'm sure, this year. So no, you can't judge him on what he didn't do, or your eye test said he would do. Yeah, no, I don't think this is unreasonable. Honestly, as I said, I do think there's a good case for him just to miss the list on purely that sort of volume alone, even if the eye test is so clearly he's amazing.
You think this is a job interview or something? Jesus, you're just gassing us up. Just love the criteria.
Yeah, this is where you lose me, though.
Maybe we're gonna have
you had me until now.
Here, though, yeah.
Like this was outrageous. I cannot believe I saw this. I was like, all right, cool. I saw him at 16. I was like, all right, Wonderful's missed the list. Sweet, fine, cool. I can put my feet up. And then I get to 11 and I see him pop up. I'm like, How has this man made it by attendance? What is this, a uni lecture? Like, I just have to tick my name off and I'll get a passing grade for it. Like, I did not like to see this at all. And I'm sure you're going to tell me a bunch of things about the number of big matches he played, the number of arena matches he played, like how often he was there. I'm just so frustrated to see Wonderful at 11. Like,
no, before Harry gets into it, I want you to make your case.
So where would he have been?
Where would he have been? Your case? Yeah.
Anywhere under 20 would have been fine. For someone who is, in my eyes, so unimpactful on the winning of his team. Like when the team won, his numbers were fine. And if you paid attention at the start of the year, when the team lost a map, his numbers were atrocious. For the entirety of spring, he was as likely to be under 0.85 as he was over 1.3. It was insane how much he just bounced from one to the other. And when they were consistently good, wow, his numbers were consistently good. And this is, it's a part of my general accumulation of annoyance overall with Na'Vi getting a lot of credit this year as a team who missed events, playoffs 5 times. I felt like they got a lot of very generous support when it comes to awards and to this list. But for me, Wonderful doesn't do enough in terms of fragging impact to make the top 20. He's unable to separate himself from what is clearly the Blade Alexi B system to ever deserve this level of credit. So I would not have had him on the top 20 at all, and just chalk it up to he farmed his DPR and cast because it was pretty easy. He hit the easy shots when they were presented to him within the flow of the game. And yeah, he's a better rifler than Torji. So when he had a rifle in his hands on the T side, he still hit the shots and kept his numbers like pretty. But overall, he's doing very little that actually moves me on the server. And yeah, this was the part that really lost me.
Yeah, it's honestly, when we did the list, I was also not too happy initially at the Wonderful one because you're in a vacuum, 2025, right? You have a passive system AWPer in the best team of the year. He's gonna get 3 EVPs. Like, he just is. Unless you're completely rubbish, you're gonna hit enough shots and have enough pop-off maps where you win a couple clutches in a key playoff game, and you're like, okay, he was player of the map there, he should get credit for that. And Wonderful's year was a little bit like that because it's so cookie cutter. Like you can even see in like the notable stats that he wasn't great in terms of actual like raw figures for the year because his bad events were bad and his peaks might have been good map to map in terms of you can see how his impact is progressing Na'Vi, but they weren't like mind-blowing numbers wise. He's also hurt a lot by rating 2.1. He's one of those players because he saves a lot. Like we can see on the graphic. So his cast was 74.7%, I think. But for the actual rating, we don't include saving in the cast, which is why his bar, like the bar is the sub rating. People never know this, but the bar is the sub rating of your cast or your impact or whatever. And yeah, he's had a survivor year. But and the way I was one round within the committee is year after year, what we have to value are event to event peaks, right? And Wonderful does have 4 of them because at Copenhagen, Copenhagen was really tricky because it kind of broke the EVP system a little bit because Na'Vi lost more rounds than they won. So it's kind of hard to divvy because they've won the tournament. You have to give a lot of credit, right? So JL got lots of credit as the MVP because it was obvious his clutches won the maps, right? Very, very obvious JL deserved that MVP. But his actual raw numbers are they're not really major MVP numbers in a weird way. But obviously because he has to get a lot of the credit from an eye test perspective a little bit as well. Like you can bump him for those clutches. And we had Wonderful as Na'Vi's second best player of that run. And it's mainly the quarterfinal, I guess, because Bit just had such a bad event other than Inferno. But everyone remembers Inferno and thinks Bit had an amazing Copenhagen. And you actually look at it, Ema's 0.88 for the event, Alexi's 0.86 or something, Wonderful's 1.07 in rating 2.1 or something. They all didn't even have good numbers, but you have to divide the credit. And at the major, I think he got the EVP for mainly Eternal Fire and being quite consistent, decent VG2. And that really helps you on a list like this. It just does. So that was a weird case. But his other 3 events are legit. His other 3 peaks, I think EWC, he would have probably got the MVP. It was very, very close, just a kind of bit of a dodgy final. And that is a theme for his year. It's in the middle. It is a studio event, but it's a bit better than a Pro League, right? But the Rio one, he was great in Rio. Full final, I can't even remember what he did at full final. Let me check. Full final 116, and I think they're in the final of that, right? So yeah, there's there are event-to-event peaks, and I think event-to-event peaks are an interesting way to do the list because it kind of brings you into the conversation of how could you not overrate teams like Na'Vi, like an exact year like Na'Vi's, where they were very up and down as a team, and they end up having very good event peaks as a team, all of them. Like, can you discount the lows as much? Because I think we'll get to it with broky as well. I think sometimes the top 20 criteria does let you get away with bad events in a way that average rating for the year doesn't let you get away with that. So that's the interesting
we always do this thing, Harry, where we delve into the HLTV forums and pick out a couple of comments, but this time around it almost feels like there's no need because just having broky at number 8 seems to have drawn out all the comments you'd possibly need to reply to.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, again, I think this one is number one, it's the event peaks again, is that we look at your best events more than we look at every event equally. And if like your best 5 events are like broky's, ones where you were quite close to an MVP and your team was really good and blah, 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 then it looks like you have a really good year under our criteria. Whereas the forums only remember the last 3 months and they say botkey and that he was crap and that he was rubbish. And especially in group stages, he is a bit rubbish. Like, you just can't really get out of bed for group stage games. But what confirmed him being so high is Shanghai playoffs. He had a terrible group stage, great in Shanghai playoffs. That's why his arena rating and big match rating is the 8th best of the year, is things like that. Even when he had bad events, he often kept up in playoffs. And then full final, he was actually amazing, which people forget. And then after the Kato and Copenhagen, he was like, him and Frozen were probably in the top 5. If you stopped the top 20 in March, and those are 2 super elite events, they're very important events at the start of the year, and people just forget about them completely, apart from Doc. And that's what probably held broky back is his impact is 0.99, and that's funny, and that got a lot of forum threads because it's another passive AWPer in a good team. But at the start of the year, I think he deserved those EVPs, and when you get those EVPs at those really important events, you're going to be high in the top 20. That's just how it has always worked, unfortunately, for that Latvian laser guy on the forums. It's just how it works.
Yeah, he has gotten, I'm not sure it's the most egregious overrating of the year because he was, like, his spring season was really strong. And I know a lot of people just forget it existed or pretend it was just one major, nothing else happened around it. But no, broky, I think, was fairly solid at the start there, but it does feel, when you think about it as a year in total, you're like, man, fall season's just that bit longer. And we did spend most of it wondering, is broky on this team still? Like, are we looking for a replacement now? Because what in the hell is going on? And he ends strong, obviously, with a bit of a run at Shanghai. But I get why people are going to be annoyed about this one. Given that I had him 8 to 10 in my guesses. Like, I thought this would be about where he'd end up, especially with the Chengdu MVP that he was given. I was like, yeah, he's probably going to end up around here. And I think I had him slightly lower when I talked about him, but I still had him in my top 15 because, he's actually doing things. As much as he is a passive AWPer overall and ends up with a lower impact, if you watch the games, he's broky. He does crackhead stuff all the time to try and go win rounds that are lost. And that really matters when it works. Sometimes he looks a bit goofy, but there's a reason his surviving percentage isn't over 40. Like, he's not pure saving. He is going for little tricks, little plays, that sometimes get him punished. But, when you watch a broky demo, you see a lot more round-winning sort of moments and plays that I think he deserves that a little bit of credit for. His overall rating won't reflect. And so I'm not mad at it, but I do think, over the course of the year, it doesn't feel like he was 8th best. And I think that's a fair complaint to have. Even though, as you said, the event peak seems to be really what you guys focus on, given, I think that's probably what directly leads to EVPs and vice versa. Like, that's just how it works. You got to value your own awards, otherwise what the hell are you doing them for? So I think that's a fair enough way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think just one more thing on broky is that kind of 7 down to nerds, even like 7 to 21. Like this is the hard part of the list, is because when you open it up, it's like, what the fuck is going to break all these ties? Because everyone's got so similar, and there's lots of very similar cases where you kind of have to end up like where you do one lower down, and you're like, okay, so we've set the precedent based on the criteria, and then if Em is above Jimmy, then X is above Y later on, right? And that's kind of But the EVPs have to be important, because the EVPs are basically us using context at the time to decide who had the best tournament. We're not looking at event rating, because when people do their own top 20s, they look at event rating, and event rating's fine, but what we're looking at is if you're really good in deciders, if you're bad in a map and you win the series 2-1, and you're good in map 1 and map 3, but you're bad in map 2, like, we kind of forgive you for map 2, and we say that you got your team further by being really good in the decider. And it's things like that. It's being able to account for opposition and arena games and pressure on the kind of minute scale, and also dividing credit between a team, because something like G2's Cologne run, when you look back, you're like, how didn't Nico and Mavs get an EVP? They had 1.25 ratings, but the whole team had 1.25 ratings because they were like 13-1ing everyone. And you have to divide credit in a way that makes sense for them to still have gone out in semis, if that makes sense. So, and I think people see EVPs as kind of like the subjective HLTV thing, but what it really is us applying the top 20 criteria with as much context as possible, as close to the event as possible, so we remember it.
I was surprised this year, because you also gave it out early comparative to previous years, where usually some of them wouldn't have even been known until months after, or potentially even when the top 20 list released.
That's something I've pushed for. I think it's much easier to predict the top 20 when they're public. Like, it's probably, like, I think, because the giveaway, like 7 people had the same team, right? And everyone's like, oh, it's been leaked, it's been rigged, it's been rigged. And it's like, that guy who did that just looked at the EVP list, basically, and understood which events were important. And it does become a bit easier to predict it, because basically, if we get to the end of the year and we make a decision that in the top 20 that doesn't rely on EVPs, it's got to be super special cases. It's EliGE, basically. So EliGE, by EVP points, is miles off it. Absolutely miles off the top 20. But his individual numbers were so good, he did get to jump in. And for someone like broky, like, it was clear number 8 on EVP points. It was quite hard to argue against it, even if it felt wrong.
Now it's time, Harry, for you to defend your alternate account, Monacy Superfan.
Yes.
Having placed ZywOo below him.
Yes. So ZywOo was better than Monacy at quite a lot of things, but they were also the same thing, which was overall stats for the year, however you package that. So everyone is messaging me saying he's got better impact, he's got better cast, and he's got better kills per round and better damage. And it's like, okay, but that's using the whole year. And the top 20 does weight more important things more importantly. And unfortunately for ZywOo, his overall rating for the year was very, very much inflated by studio lands that people have been telling us for years that we overrate, like Pro League. And unfortunately, when a player like Monacy has an extra MVP, is 0.1 better in majors, 0.09 better in Super Elite, which is majors Cologne, Katowice, and then he's 0.04 better in Elite, which is including the free Blast events, and that was controversial as well, but that's because they're basically like the top 6 teams were there for most of it, apart from Mouse, I think, for the spring and fall. And it's like the level of competition is so high, and it's such a short event. Like, it doesn't ruin the sample size to include Blast events. And then arena rating as well. Like, people are focusing on arena rating because I invented it, and I hate French people, apparently.
But I'm here.
That's what they're focusing on. But 0.11? 0.11 is quite a lot. And when you add that to the majors and to the super elites, you can see how being 0.08 rating better, when you include the whole year, including RMRs, which ZywOo farmed, and Pro Leagues, which ZywOo farmed, you can see how we can build the case for Monacy number 2. And I think it's close. It's down to what you value more. And if you want to tell me that you value Pro League more than the majors and the super elite events, then that's fine. That's absolutely fine. You can make your own list and value those things more. But I promise you're going to get cases where Blame F is suddenly number 6 on your ranking. And there's just random things. Like last year, if we hadn't done this criteria, you're going to get random things. And like if it was just RMRs, Nohte would be like the second best player of the year because he's just an RMR farmer. But the top 20 is about the prestigious moments. And I think, I don't know. I think KingT probably agrees with me on this one.
Oh, entirely. This isn't even a
it's just
close
studio
one
farming. We're not talking about studio farming here.
Crazy agenda from Harry to only get people who agree with him as guests on this show.
The thing is, I've even got every reason to be biased the other way. I am a frog. I know I'm in disguise, got the voice of an Englishman, but, I carry the passport proud, still French, so haven't converted, haven't changed my my jersey. I'm still out here repping French colours. But I'm sorry, ZywOo, if you are someone like me who watches it and wants ZywOo to win, it's so frustrating in all the big games that matter. You always have to end up arguing against a slew of Vitality fans who are like, what about Flamesy, Spinks, Apex called everything wrong, Xtaz, bald fraud, like Mezzy as well, also somehow always to blame. And then you watch ZywOo's POV, it's like, he just missed. He missed again. That's a key gun round gone because ZywOo whiffed in the big playoff moment. And you have to blame him because he's got the big green. He's set up to take every fight. We flash for him. That's a thing for a reason. He is the best player on the team and he does get set up for things. So the fact that he was so poor in every single, essentially prestigious metric for me, like if you're not that good in the majors, not that good super elite events, not that good on arenas, I don't care about the rest of your numbers. The rest of your numbers are meaningless to me. And yeah, sure, great. You're one Pro League MVP. At an event you didn't even win, if I'm not going crazy. Like, you didn't even win the Pro League.
Session was better than him in the final of that event.
Yeah, it's a fraudulent MVP as well. Like, I wasn't interested. Like, that was...
It's like 1.6 rating, by the way, as well.
Yeah.
1.6 People also forget that he was, like,
Malta.
sick in Copenhagen, like, actually sick, and barely had any impact during the group stage. Kind of got carried through it by Flames and Spinks.
Which is harsh. It's harsh to say that held him back, because it's just quite hard to be up. But then m0NESY had spring final where he had a terrible time because he got out of the taxi and was told he wasn't allowed to practice. Like, we filmed him running out the taxi, and then Blast were like, the game starts in 60 seconds, and he's still plugging in his mouse. So you're like, okay, this is great. So these things happen. It's a sport. You have to. There's lots of events where people are ill where it's not mentioned in every interview. We just have to look at it as what it is. And unfortunately for ZywOo, I'm sorry, you're the third best player of the year. That's still quite good. Like, this big three was so close to each other. I think ZywOo's second half of the year was actually incredible, the way he built back into the year, because if you pause the halfway point, like, he's still third because the raw numbers were so good. But like, I think m0NESY and Dog were probably even further ahead. I think m0NESY was probably at top at halfway. It's
I don't know if I'd say it's top.
I think m0NESY got better in the second half too. If my feeling is m0NESY did get better in the second half too. Like, that was...
I think, well, they were all... It was also close, but I think m0NESY's major was nuts. m0NESY's Kato was also nuts. It was just kind of overshadowed by Donk a little bit. And I think ZywOo's first few months probably... he took a while to get going, is what I mean. And we could talk about this all day, but it does come down to kind of where you draw the line on filters. And yeah, I wanted to include this as well, because I get told on a daily basis now that I invented arena rating to make m0NESY number 2. This is from the article where arena rating was invented, and it's in May 2023. And I'd like to direct you to the bottom of the graph. And that's m0NESY, by the way, stinking it up with a minus 0.1 difference between his normal rating and arena rating in 2023. I think this is like the last 12 months or something. It's like 2022 to 2023. And baby m0NESY, child m0NESY, was bad in arena games. And I bet at the end of the year, it hurt him. Oh, wait, it did, didn't it? Because Rops was number 3 and m0NESY was number 4, because we looked at arena rating last year too. So when people tag me on things on HLTV, that's fine. You're allowed to say that arena racing is bad because it's low sample size. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. That's your opinion. You have different criteria to the list. But don't tell me that I invented it to put m0NESY second, because it's been here for 10 years. And I'm looking forward to not speaking about that until next year when I get told that I invented it to put like Heavy God 11th or something. And if that happens now, it's going to look bad. But you know what I mean? Like, it's just... it shouldn't let it bother me, but it does bother me. I'm still nibbling. I even nibbled on a thread like yesterday. I need to relax. But
so keep tagging Harry.
It's not invented for Manasseh's benefit. If anything, I probably annoyed him a bit if he saw this article. He's like, oh shit, I'm a bit of a fraud. But he's not a fraud anymore. It's growth. And Xerxion's not on this graph, is he? But you never know. The same thing could happen next year. And then we'll reward him for that improvement.
I think you making this article and making it more of a conversation topic just made people realize that it is actually something that's considered more. But somehow, since your name's on it, you started getting all the flack for it also being weighted, even though it's always been there.
So the interesting one is, you know, the 2020, which is really controversial? Because the simple number one for a lot of people in 2020, right? The reason he wasn't is because Peter looked at big event playoffs and ZywOo was better. That was the tiebreaker, unless I'm mistaken. I think that's come up before, but and that was the tiebreaker, and that's something that people didn't have access to because there's no playoff filter on the website as much as I think there should be soon, hopefully. But that was the tiebreaker, and everyone was kind of fuming about it because they wanted simple number one because of eye test and this idea that ZywOo lets you down in the big moments. That's still there. And obviously a lot of it's online, and Simple had the better LAN event that year. But yeah, the point is it's always mattered. We've always looked at how you do in the playoffs of the most important events of the year. And yes, that's a small sample size, but it's also the most important sample size, just however you cook it. And it's always, always, always going to matter for the top 20. Always.
So that's from 2020. Because I've received recently some comments telling me that HLTV disproved the idea that ZywOo was ever bad in playoffs. And I've got a weird feeling that's what that's based off. Because it can't be based off of this year where he's, categorically worse. That might be why I've had that sort of comment come up where it's like, you guys have disproved the idea.
Yeah, so when we say he drops off in arena games, he's still got a 1.25 arena rating for this year. So
he's still a superstar.
Bonkers, absolute bonkers. And I've got it up 2020. So in 2020, when a lot of people think Simple should have been number one, he had a 1.29 rating in a big event playoffs, and he had a 1.10 plus rating in every single playoff series that year. So this, if you're a ZywOo fan, you look at this and you say, okay, he got number one that year because of playoffs. Would you rather have number one in 2020 or number two in 2024? I think I know what you'd pick. And we're going to still rate arena matches and big matches because that is what matters. It's when you're under the lights. It's when broky's nonsense play can work because the crowd is screaming. I know it's not pure CS, it's not bedroom CS, but it's the most exciting CS. It's the matches that you all tune in for. And you tune in for a reason when it's a big arena because it's more exciting. And, it's the same. It's the same. Like Didier Drogba. Where would Didier Drogba's career be if he didn't score a goal in every cup final? He's scored like 15 goals a season, but he's remembered as one of the greats because he scored in every cup final.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Lastly,
equalized against Bayern Munich.
Lastly, we're talking about the race for third place Women's Player of the Year. I believe this is a topic that KingT wanted to talk about specifically. Yep. So maybe you can give us your early thoughts on that and explain the reasoning for this conversation.
Well, for me, it basically stems from, I know why this is sort of like a HLTV logic top three, and if you apply the exact criteria we use on the open circuit, yeah, I guess if you're just talking about the LANs and who played best at the two LANs that the women's CS scene has for the year, an Imperial top three makes sense. But unfortunately, the majority of the women's scene, is just online, and there's nothing they can do about that. That's just the Counter-Strike they play 90% of the year. And so for me, Tori ending up in third over the course of the year, not only was it not a great reflection of what I believe the eye test shows, which is Isa, Hanka. I have Hanka at 3, honestly. I think she's going to be a terror for years to come if the women's scene still exists, that is. It needs support. Teams are dropping like flies. But for me, Hanka, fragged like a maniac, did everything she could on an RV Javelin side that made some weird roster moves to try and improve themselves, but in some ways I feel like they really hampered some of the chemistry, the flow of the comms, everything just, I think, took a bit of a hit, so it didn't actually work quite how they expected. But that's not what matters. What matters is Hanka as a fragger, as a monster, played in the toughest scene in the women's scene, because the EU region is so competitive and so difficult. Like, they finished 5th in the Impact just to go through to the finals, and to do that they had to battle to the very last day. Like, that's how difficult it was. Even as probably the second best women's team of the year, Na'Vi Javelin still had to actually go to war just to make LAN playoffs over and over again. So I don't think it's fair to judge the women's year so heavily by the LANs, especially when you look at events like Trade It FE Masters, one of the few places that women's teams can actually get prize money, keep the lights on, keep themselves earning. Na'Vi Javelins were able to consistently win those, and when Imperial FE made the grand final, beat them in a best of 5. And I think, as much as we do typically weigh more heavily on the LANs, it's so even tinier of a sample here that, for me, we have to give more consideration to all the online play, the 90% of the year where Imperial FE aren't so clearly the best team. And Na'Vi Javelins, if you listen to a lot of the chatter behind the scenes, Na'Vi Javelins are only not the best team because Imperial FE have that much of an edge still at LAN. And it's that tiny difference. And sure, it justifies Ana at 1, Zaz at 2. It starts for me to take the piss when we get to Tori at 3. And I'm just like, Hanka is just a better player. And so much of the year is being thrown away by the fact that it isn't LAN, that I feel like she should be taking that spot. That's my case for it. Again, you're probably gonna have to hit me with my eye test thing, but I can't get away from it. My eyes work and I register what happens. Like, that's just how it is for me.
Yeah, and it's not just the eye test. I think the thing with EVPs is the same. It's the same in the women's game as it is in any game. Like Astralis 2018, right? It broke the system. I think it's under the criteria. It was fair to have 5 Astralis players in the top 14 or whatever it was, right?
It was quite easy to justify if you look at the stats and the reasoning. And you're like, Glaive number 8, when he has that great of a rating in the playoffs, you just can't deny it. I mean, Wonderful at 11 is a different story, but I actually have less against the 2018 Glaive 5, Astralis 5 than I do against the Na'Vi 4 of this year. That's crazy to say, but I genuinely do.
Yeah, I think it's a similar thing with Tori, right? I think it was, let me check. It was Stockholm. I think it's season 6. It's the second one, I think, where she was just really, really good. I think she probably would have been the MVP of that, right? If we were doing HLTV MVP process, she would have got the MVP of what's essentially like the second major of the year for the women's game. And unfortunately, that does matter a lot for us. And it is hard because we're not going to pretend we watch every Trade It Cup. We're not, we don't. We do look at the stats for it, and we do look at the impact stuff in more detail because that's just what makes sense to do. And I can see how, we spoke to a few people from the women's scene to try and work out what events we should prioritize and stuff, because there was something like IASF, obviously Hanka won it, but I think there was a few players who played really, really well. And it's like, does this matter more in the women's game than the men's game? And it's like, obviously it does, but it's still kind of Mickey Mouse. It's still kind of hard to judge. And it was the same with the Trade It. So we spoke to a few people. And I think it's really tricky because Fluxo and Furia had really good years and they just couldn't play any of them because they're in Brazil. And there was the disconnected EU and Brazilian thing is kind of like the 2020 again, where you have split scenes, and it's like, how do you rate Furia winning, a Brazilian Cup versus Na'Vi Javelins winning the Trade It Cup? And you can say, well, they beat Imperial, so it matters more, and that's fine. That's an easy argument to make. I think if we looked at every women's tournament in the same amount of detail as the men's tournament, maybe you get a slightly different result. I'm not saying that's impossible. But when you're on very limited time in top 20 season, I just have to admit, we don't do that. We don't look at it in as much detail. We look at the events that we are told are notable. And at those, Tori was the MVP of one, Anna was second or third in 2, and then Zaz was, I think, probably the MVP of the first one but it was really close between all 4 of them, I think. And there's Isa as well, or Isa, I'm not going to try and say that in a Brazilian accent. So she had a 1.26 rating, I think, at the events we considered, 1.27, because these graphs are from Lucy. I think Lucy would have had her third. I don't know if she was trying to apply the HLTV criteria because we weren't doing it. I don't know if that was actually her subjective list or just her trying to use our criteria, but so that it was arguable. I think 3 to 5, even on our spreadsheets and things, it was pretty close. And as you probably suspect, the edge went to Tory because of the land stuff, because it's just what we prioritize this year. And I think it's something that I want to pay more attention to in 2025 as well, is when there are women's events, because there's definitely not enough of them. And I think it's something we want more of, obviously. I do want to pay more attention to it so that we can do a bit more justice to this, because we are coming at it kind of blind. And I think from what most people said, Tori probably was still a top 5 player. Like, it's not completely outrageous.
Oh, no, she's a beast.
But yeah, of course you benefit from being in the team that won both lands. It's tricky.
Yeah.
I'm just wrapping it up. KingT, do you have any parting words, any final thoughts across the top 20, the awards, anything you want to say personally? Did you feel like you had any disagreements with Harry in the end, or are you happy
still
with
do? Yeah, I don't buy for 1 second any of the wonderful spiel, and I never will, just to be clear. And for me, overall, what I consider the HLTV Awards to be, the top 20 to be, is a reflection of 2024. And I feel like it feels like a slight disservice that we have Na'Vi, have Coach of the Year, IGL of the Year, 4 top 20 players off of 4 big event wins. It feels like, I don't feel like we've had a true record kept of what the year was, because they were a team who bottomed out of every event they didn't make the grand final of. They were pitiful in those moments. And what made them work so well, and what also let them down, is that they had an IGL and a coach who made somewhat underperforming, somewhat unreliable pieces look far better than, honestly, they overall actually played as individuals, as fraggers. They just weren't that impressive to me, especially when you look at players like Emma, like Wonderful. I think Bit and JL getting the most credit is easy to do. Those two coming along for the ride kind of puts a bit of a taint on it for me, and that's just my big issue overall has been, because I mean, I'll be honest, I have, obviously, like everyone else, immediately when there's a player announced, when there's an award announced, I'm on Twitter, I'm thinking about how can I disagree with this to get people to click on my videos. But I do think there's a certain amount of truth to the overall sentiment I have, which is I don't feel like we've really done the year justice. This wasn't a Na'Vi era. They weren't that dominant a team. I don't think the gap between 1 and 2, honestly, one of the awards we didn't cover was Team of the Year. G2 finishing at second over Spirit. Outrage, but I can throw hands with someone about that.
It's a decimal point. It's a decimal point.
They shouldn't be close. It shouldn't be close. They won 2 prestige events. The conversation should be over. But we'll save that for another boxing match. It's just, I think, a slightly improper kept historical record as to who truly dominated the year, how the year should be reflected. They weren't that great. And we're going to realize that pretty quickly this year as everyone else levels up and they stagnate. I'm just calling it now. Come at me when I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, I won't be wrong. But it's fine. Come at me when I'm wrong.